It's really nice to see everybody this evening. Thank you for coming out and for being with us this evening for what I think is going to be a really interesting conversation. We're going to run it as a bit of a panel, questions backwards and forwards, and then I'll try very hard to make time to ensure that we can pick up any questions if they're in the room as well. A little tiny piece about me, although I'm not the star of this, my three colleagues here certainly are. So my name is Niamh Daeid. I'm a professor of forensic science at the University of Dundee, and I have the privilege to be the director of the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science, which is the biggest research centre in the UK, dedicated to being a little disruptive about how we review the way in which science is both used within our courts in a positive way, disruptive I mean, and also to ensure that there's a robustness behind the science that we bring into the courts, and that we enter that science in the right and appropriate way. And I know that there was one audience question a little bit about that, so we might pick up on that as we go. I'm going to introduce the panel, and I'm going to start with Professor Anne Coxon, who's sitting here beside me. Anne is a professor of practice in forensic science, and she's the deputy director of the Leverhulme Centre. She, before coming to our centre in April of last year, Anne spent 8 years at Forensic Science South Australia, based in Adelaide, where latterly she was the assistant director of operations responsible for the delivery of forensic science and pathology services to the state of South Australia. She has 20 years' experience as a technical expert and science leader within the field of clandestine drug laboratories. So that's where they make illicit drugs, the kind of laboratories that are involved in that. And she gained that while she was working at the Institute for Environmental Science and Research in New Zealand. In her current role, and she'll talk a little bit about this, I'm sure, Anne combines this extensive practitioner-based forensic science experience with skills developed through studying an MBA to ensure that the research outcomes that we have are aligning with what's needed by operational practitioners. So it's a really important role that starts to ensure that what we do in the university actually makes a difference out in the world. Beside Anne is Ashley Edwards, King's Counsel and Principal Crown Counsel. Ashley was appointed to the role of Principal Crown Counsel in February 2022. And when she was appointed to the post, it was the first time, this is quite phenomenal, it was the first time in Scottish legal history that the offices of the Lord Advocate, the Solicitor General, and the Principal Counsel of Scotland were all held by women. Ashley has been, there you go, go round for applause for that. Ashley, quite right too. Ashley has been an Advocate Depute since 2008. She's a member of the Faculty of Advocates and was called to the bar in 2000. Prior to holding a commission from the Lord Advocate, she practiced at the Criminal Defence Bar. She took Silk in 2016, and in addition to her legal qualifications, she also has a bachelor's degree in pharmacology. She is responsible for leading and managing a team of 70 Advocate Deputes across Scotland, and these Advocate Deputes appear on behalf of the Lord Advocate and conduct all of the prosecutions and appeals in the High Court of the Judiciary. And last but by absolutely no means least, we're really delighted to be joined by Dr. Shalini Gupta. Shalini is a lecturer at the University of Dundee in the School of Medicine, and she lectures within undergraduate and postgraduate educational programs. She is a dual professional, leading both pharmacology in the curriculum as well as medical education research and projects in that area within the School of Medicine. She is a professional learning framework advanced higher education fellowship. Goodness, that's a lot. And she reviews and mentors within this area, supporting staff in the university in advancing their professional development. She is also the communication lead for the BME staff network at the University of Dundee. So that's your panel, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm sure that you recognise the breadth of experience that we have up here with us. But I'm going to start by maybe exploring that just a little bit more, and perhaps with Anne, because you're closest to me. We've given a very potted CV, but I wonder, do you want to share a little bit more just briefly about your your role and the development of your career to get you where you are now, and whether there was anything in the beginning that particularly caused you to pursue this path, that inspired you to do what it is that you do.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming along. I actually started my career life as a pharmacist, and I sort of fell into that. At the age of 7, all I ever wanted to be was either a hairdresser or a Gurkha. And I was very disappointed when my mum told me I wasn't allowed to be a Gurkha. So I wanted to be a dentist from that moment on, didn't make the grades for dentist, became a pharmacist. But having worked for a year as a pharmacist, it really wasn't for me. So it was time for change. I'd always wanted or enjoyed or looked at the postgraduate course in forensic science. And yep, I'll put my hand up. I loved all those programs as a kid, good old Quincy, the bad face back then. And actually some friends of the family worked at Strathclyde University, so I was aware of the Strathclyde University Forensic Science program. So I made the decision, which was quite difficult at the time. I was a pharmacist. I was in a career that was good money and had a career path that it just wasn't for me, and I needed to go back to being a student. So I ultimately did that, did the MSc in Forensic Science, got to the end of that, and there wasn't really a job that I fancied. I quite liked being a student, so I ended up doing my PhD in Forensic Science and Analytical Chemistry at Strathclyde. And at the end of that, just sent my CV off around the world to any English-speaking forensic laboratory. And, it's right time, right place, who was in the positions. And the head of the Drug and Toxicology Unit in Auckland, New Zealand, had done a swap with the Metropolitan Police Lab, who just happened to be the person who was my PhD supervisor. So there was that connection. They interviewed me. I got on a plane and went to New Zealand. And yes, I actually had to get a map book out to find out where it was. But it was an area I was always interested in. And I think it was around, for me, solving problems. I've got a very logical, evidence-based brain. It's all got to make sense to me. And putting that to use in an area that, yes, was interested to me and I was totally fascinated by. So when I got there, I realised that being a drugs analyst, again, would take me probably for 2 or 3 years, and then I'd be it's going to be the mundane, as with a lot of jobs are. But at the time in New Zealand, they started to see chemicals being imported into New Zealand to make methamphetamine. They'd never seen this before. Me being me, put my hand up and went, I'll sort this out. And again, it was an opportunity that was in front of me that I picked up and I took. And I think that's really important through my whole career. You have an idea of what you want to do and where you want to go, and an opportunity, presents itself. And I think it was, what's he called, from Virgin, Richard Branson. That's him, Richard Branson, who said, if someone gives you an opportunity, say yes, and then figure out how you're going to do it. And I've sort of lived my life by that, looking back. So it was a huge job. I loved every minute of it. I mean, it went on for years, and for the first few years, we never had the resources to deal with a number of what they call clandestine drug laboratories that were occurring in New Zealand. So places where people were making drugs in the kitchen, in the hotels, in the barns, wherever it may be. But my role there was to actually develop the response for these types of labs from the forensic science perspective. I also worked with the police to help them develop their protocols, policies, and procedures for dealing with them from frontline perspective. Later on in my career, I did that for probably about 15 years, and we were still developing at the end. I was working with policymakers, with government, around why should we change the legislation for children in labs, as it was called. So people who are manufacturing in their homes with children of all ages running around in the midst of all of it, and why it was more damaging for children. So I had to write a whole paper for them around why particular chemicals and drugs were worse for toddlers and children than adults, in order to push this legislation through. After about 15 years of being on call 24/7, as part of a team, I decided I'd really got to the end of it. I had a lot of enthusiastic staff who were coming through going, oh yes, what was it that scene you went to? And it was just another scene. And I figured it's time for me to move on. And I wanted to move into management. again, to challenge myself, push myself out there. What can I do to help the staff deliver the services we need to deliver? I moved to Australia to do that. And then after 2 years was promoted into my boss who retired, his position as assistant director, where absolutely fascinating. I was privileged enough to be in a position where I had to work with experts from pathologists, forensic pathologists, toxicologists, DNA, chemistry, huge learning curve for me, but in delivering services to the state of South Australia. So a very, very different perspective. And I think throughout my career, I've been lucky. I've been in the right place at the right time. The opportunities have come and I've put my hand up and I've taken them. And driving force for me is variety and time to push myself outside my comfort zone.
Ashley, I'm going to ask you next. I'll ask you if you would mind.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, to say, listening to you, lots of things that have happened to you and the stages that you've gone through, very similar things happened to me, just being in the right place at the right time and saying yes. I started off very similar. I didn't want to be a lawyer when I was growing up. I wanted to be a PE teacher, a vet, and I think that was it. Those are the only two things I wanted to do. When I left school, I thought, what shall I do? What shall I do at university? Pharmacology. I like the medicine side. Never quite made the grade for doing medicine, so I thought, okay, let's try pharmacology. I then, once I graduated, got a job with a pharmaceutical company, which was a great job. It was very well paid. It had lots of perks and a brand new car. And I was earning lots more than any of my friends, but I didn't like the job. I was a drug rep. Although it had all the perks, I wasn't very good at it and I didn't like it. So I looked around and thought, what am I going to do next? By this point, I had moved down south and I was living just outside Sheffield. All of the drug companies at that time were all based in the home counties, so anything that I wanted to do next was London-based. And I thought, no, I would like to move back up to Scotland. What should I do? At that time, my mum had a restaurant in Broughty Ferry, so I came back and I chefed for a year and I worked in the kitchen. And I looked around and I thought, what can I do at university that will get me a job at the end of it? So something vocational. Okay, let's try law. And I did that and I liked it. I did an accelerated degree. I did my traineeship in Dundee and then I started in the criminal courts and I liked that. So I thought, where should I go next? I worked for Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service in Dundee, prosecuting in the Sheriff Court, and I liked that. I went to the then, after about 2.5 years there, I went to the then Procurator Fiscal in Dundee and said, okay, I've been doing this for 2 years now. I think I can do it okay. I'd like a pay rise. And he said, no, can't give you a pay rise. And I said, okay, what will I do next? And then I decided to go to the bar. And at that stage, I had a huge support from my family, who, particularly my mum and dad, who looked after my very young child. And I went and called at bar. I devilled for 10 months, which meant you had to follow your devil master, who was a qualified advocate around. And you weren't allowed to earn during that time, so you had to fund yourself for that 10-month period. Your devil master would pay for your lunches and your coffees, sometimes for your transport, but aside from that, you had to be self-funding. Once I had done that, I called at the bar. I had this idea that I would maybe work in some commercial area, that I would do something to do with pharmacology. I would maybe look at patents. I didn't quite think it through about exactly what I was going to do, but that was the idea, was to marry my two sets of qualifications. I got instructions in the criminal law because that had been my experience, and I had friends in Dundee, solicitors, who gave me instructions and supported me in my earlier years, and that's how it started. I said yes. I went into criminal defence work. 8 years later, the Crown asked me to come and prosecute. I said yes. I became a trial advocate depute. I liked that. I stayed there in the trial team for 3 years and they asked me if I'd like to stay and become a senior, and I said yes. And thereafter, it was just the opportunities that presented me as I went along, and I sort of stumbled to where I am now. And the job now that I do is a bit much more managerial than I originally started out with the Crown. Advocate deputies, there's a team of advocate deputies, and they prosecute all the serious criminal trials in Scotland. So murders, serious sexual offending, serious and organised crime, drugs offences, although not so many drugs offences now in the High Court. They mostly find their way into the Sheriff Court. But the organised crime end of drug offences find their way into the High Court. As a trial advocate deputy, that's what you're doing. You're pretty much doing those trials back to back. You're preparing cases for the High Court, and then you're running the trials. Trials can be anything from 4 days up into 10, 12, 16 weeks. It depends on the subject matter. By the time you're a senior advocate deputy, you're doing the more significant long-running trials and also appearing in the appeal court. Once you get into the principal Crown Counsel team, now that we're a team of 70 advocate deputies, there's much more a managerial role, trying to organise how the advocate deputies work, how we manage the resources, how we make sure that there's an advocate deputy ready to run a trial, prepared and ready to present the trial on behalf of the Crown. So my job is a lot more about managing people rather than simply dealing with the day-to-day law things. That's me.
Thank you. And Shalini, tell us a little bit about your journey to here.
So I'm not from the forensic world. I'm from the medical side of things. I'll start the other way around if you don't mind. I'll start with my current role and then go in and out. So I'm currently a lecturer in the School of Medicine, and I've got diverse roles and several diverse teams to manage. One of the roles involved medical education research. All my roles do involve working with students a lot. So I do a lot of teaching, assessment, supervision, research with the students. Also, a big part of my day is spent in program development and curriculum review. So really quality enhancement of the medical programs, both undergraduate and postgraduate. Now, as you can gather from my looks and my accent, I'm not a local. So I was born, brought up in India, where I trained as a doctor and did indeed practice for a good few years before moving to the UK. Since moving to the UK, I sort of got disconnected with clinical practice and somehow just got drawn into more and more into education. And I did like it. I started enjoying. I realized that I do feel passionate for students. I do want them to thrive. I want them to enjoy the course. And there are only 24 hours in the day. So at some point you need to make a choice. You can't just do everything. So I kind of dropped clinical practice. And got into education full time. Quite enjoyed research as well, and medical education. I don't know if you've heard of Centre for Medical Education. It enrolls students worldwide, and so I got a chance to advance my research not just in medicine but also in education. As I was listening to both of your stories, I'm very fascinated, and I do realize that despite coming from a very different geographical region and having my own path into specialization into my own niche subject, there are quite a few parallels as well in my journey and perhaps yours. Something big one being loving the job that you do, loving your subject, having a passion for medicine or education or whatever we do. And that's kind of the driving force for excelling in the work and also the fundamental reason for success in whatever we do. So either we like what we do or we do what we like. And that's kind of necessary almost to thrive. And like people say, you can't pour from an empty cup. So we need to be feeling satisfied and fulfilled in what we do and then then we can make the others around us feel the same. Yeah, so I haven't gone much into my personal stories, but yeah, we'll be happy to answer questions later on if anyone's interested.
In terms of just picking up on that sort of that last piece that you were saying about, you know, the importance of really feeling a passion for what it is that you do, and I suppose I have two questions, and I'll come to all of you. The first is to get to where you are now. I'm sure there have been obstacles. There always are challenges on the road that we travel, and you know, is there anything specific in terms of barriers that you found, particularly as being women in the roles that you're in, that you had to overcome? But also, could you tell us a little bit about the sort of diversity within the roles that you're in, and by that I mean, are there more women in those career areas, or are there more men, and what's the sort of breakdown of that, and what you feel about, what you think about it?
Will I go
I'll
first?
start with you first.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You've got the microphone. See, that's it.
Okay. So, yeah, one of the things is that medical school does seem to be dominated by women now. So if you look at the demographics of students entering, 3/5 is females, or people identifying as females.
Could you speak in the microphone? I can't hear properly.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I'm trying to say that despite the demographic of the medical school is dominated by girls and females now, more than ever, and this has been the case for a good few years now. So that kind of sticks. So medical students, you've got more girls, and then later on you have more female junior doctors, and then registrars, and then consultant level, and as well as in the academia. But the proportion does switch as you reach the higher levels. So if you come to the dean's level, there might be just one associate dean who is a lady, and the others are men still. So that in terms of the teams that I work with, we have more women in professional services. We have quite a few women doing the academic side of things. So we don't look at it in gender-based. I mean, when you're working, you're not as acutely aware of the gender aspect of it. But invariably, there might be situations when it does come up, and so if there are opportunities, folks might have questions: is she going to be able to do it? She has young children and things like that. So, yeah, I think there are stereotypical mindset and those which are kind of ingrained in the structures of institutions, and as well as in the minds. But yeah, as we work, we wouldn't be able to categorize people on the basis of efficiency and things. Yeah, it's very much an individual thing.
Ashley, an institution as old as the law, do you see that sort of ingrained institutional pathways that causes gender imbalances in your teams and the work you do?
Did I see it from the inside as I was moving through it? Not really. The barriers that I faced were not gender specific, I don't think. I think they were geographical, because everything that is Crown Office or the area of law that I'm working in is Edinburgh based. Now it's slightly more, it's Edinburgh and Glasgow based, but I live up in Angus, so geographically it was quite difficult for me to travel to the main areas of the courts. Since COVID, the courts sit in their circuit courts now a lot more. So we have advocate deputies moving, working, or travelling to courts in Aberdeen, Inverness, Kilmarnock, Paisley. So the geographical issues are not so acute now. There were financial issues initially because of the period that I talked about deviling when I went to the bar. You had to have the financial resilience to be able to do that 10 months. And if that's coming after you've already had a career in something else and you've already got commitments and financial responsibilities, that was quite difficult. I had a brilliant support network, and My family looked after, as I said earlier, my son, who was very young at the time. So were there any gender-based barriers at that stage? I don't think so. And as you were talking about there being a predominance of women in your at the lower echelons of your where you work, at the medical school, it's very similar in the law, and particular in the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. Although the Crown Council team are independent of the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, we are all deputies of the Lord Advocate, and the Lord Advocate is the head of the Prosecution Service. So the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service underpins what we do. They're our support network. And I asked for some statistics from them, and their employees are 70% female in Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. But again, once you get to the senior civil service level, you're moving down to maybe 40% rather than that 70%. So I think the short answer to your question is no, I didn't see any gender-based barriers, I don't think.
Same question to you, and particularly your experience of what forensic science is like. I know you have a good understanding of it here, but also what it's like over in down in that other part of the world.
And like your stories, forensic science is actually, and this is generally sort of worldwide, certainly both over here and in Australia and New Zealand, it's about 70% women. And a lot of that would be the laboratory side of things. Now, the job I did was from crime scene to court, 24-hour on call. And it wasn't the most glamorous of roles, I have to say. We would be out there, we'd have lots of different layers of overalls on, breathing apparatus, all taped into our suit, work boots, and then we'd go through a decontamination shower, take all this off, and you just look like a drowned rat half the time. So was not a particularly one you'd expect to find a female, but our group at the largest was 12 people. All we did was clandestine drug laboratories, and we probably 2 males, I think, was the most we had at any one time. That group is a little bit more balanced out now. I think they've got a few more males into it, but certainly forensic science across the board is about 70% women. But again, like yourself, when I became the assistant director in South Australia, I was the first female executive they'd ever had in that organisation. People would come up to me and say, "Oh, it's so nice to see a woman up here." Like yourself, did I see it from the inside? I was like, why are people commenting on that? What about the fact that I actually have the skills to do this job? But that, as their organisation, that was something that a lot of people identified with. It is changing. I know when early on in my career, and probably towards about 8-9 years ago, if you looked at the Australia and New Zealand Executive Committee, Forensic Science Executive Committee, which were the directors of all the forensic laboratories in New Zealand and Australia, that was predominantly all white male. When I left, you looked around that room and you were getting to about 40% females sitting around that table, if not more. So it is improving. There are initiatives to improve that in forensic science, particularly in Australia and New Zealand. Having said that, when I did leave my job from Australia and come over here to join the Leverhulme Centre, on our executive, which was 2 assistant directors and the director and the business manager, 3 were female, and the other was 1 assistant director who was male. Above that, our executive director of the Attorney General's Department, who my boss reported to, was female. The chief executive of the Attorney General's Department was female, and the Attorney General was female as well. So particularly the 1 assistant director was sitting saying, I don't think we've got a problem with gender up at this level now. But across the board, it is an issue that needs to be worked at, and it is being worked at, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, to make sure women are progressing up through to the higher senior more roles in forensic science.
And I think that's when you look also at Scotland's record, we're in a situation where I was speaking about Ashley's role. We're also in a situation in Scotland now where we have a female police constable. We've got a female cabinet secretary for justice. we've got a female Lord Advocate, we've got a female in the role of the second highest judge in the land, so that there is something now where you are beginning to have this kind of nexus of women who can break through, or who have broken through those barriers and can be beacons for people following in their footsteps. And I guess to sort of expand slightly more in the roles that you currently have, and particularly, Shalini, around looking at medical education and educating that next generation of surgeons and registrars and people that hold those really high roles. While many of those women, while many women or people who identify as women hold jobs at the sort of lower or middle rank, what can we do to get that progression up into the higher ranks of some of these really important roles, but also institutions? Just remember to hold the mic up, because it's that mic I don't think is a great one. This one is a bit better.
Yeah, so I can speak from my personal experience, what I have found useful. I think mentors and role models play a very important role. I wouldn't be where I am today without the support of some incredible mentors at various stages. They don't always have to be women mentors. They can be either. They just have to be good mentors. So and that's maybe something that institutions can look at, the mentoring pipeline for everyone. Also, it's a very widely used term, but not very widely understood in that sense. What exactly is the role of a mentor? And they do put the onus on the mentee. It's mentee driven, yes, but the trust and the guidance that they get from mentors is very important. So my mentors, the ones who I've affected, have not just opened doors for me, but they've reinforced my confidence when I wasn't sure whether it was the right thing for me or I would be able to do it. They've kind of imparted and shared their own journey with me, and kind of almost given me tips around navigating institutional politics and hierarchies and things like that, which are really insider. There's a kind of hidden curriculum that we say, it's not spelled out anywhere. It's also about, say, championing the cause or even extending supports in meetings, strategic meetings and things like that. So I think that is very critical for the goodwill to be there, and also for the mentors and role models. Unfortunately, like we say, the numbers go down, and as you advance, it's difficult to find them. But then again, they don't have to be from the same gender. They can be anyone who's willing to invest in the succession planning almost. I also do feel, and this is especially post-pandemic, the flexibility, and this one thing that COVID has taught us is that productive workers or intelligent students don't have to be in the office, and you can achieve excellence. So flexibility is another key thing, I think, in terms of both time and space, which can perhaps, it's relevant for men as well, but I think for all genders, it's important that they have the flexibility, and that can perhaps help in retention and reduce dropouts that we have. If that answers your question to some extent. Yeah.
Ashley, about the structures that might be in the Crown Office on the one hand, but also when you have the advocates working in the court systems or services as well, are there things there around the structures that could be more beneficial to encourage more women to go up into those higher ranks or gain more of that specific experience?
With regard to structures, we're a little bit dictated by the job that we do and the court times. So we don't really have much homeworking. If you're preparing a case for trial and preparing a set of cases, then you can prep those cases at home. But if you have to come in to go to court, and you have to work during the court hours. Usually it's during the court hours plus X and out a number of hours per day. If you're running a trial, that pretty much is your life. So you're trialing during the day, you're prepping at night for the next day, and you're then into all your witnesses. And eventually, usually over the weekend, if you're lucky, if you get it to the weekend, you've got speech writing. So once you're in that actual trial situation, it's pretty much full on. So there's not much within the advocate depute team that we can do to change that, because we're specifically dictated by court times. We, as much as we can, do flexible working, but in general we like everyone to be in Crown Office, or at least in the office together, particularly if you're preparing for cases. Advocate deputies also mark the most serious cases, so the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal will prepare a case and then give it to Crown Counsel to look at it and decide what's going to happen to it. So whether it proceeds to court, whether it proceeds in the High Court or the Sheriff Court, those are the decisions that Crown Counsel are making. And in order to have continuity of those decisions, we need them together. We need them to be listening, chatting, discussing the decision-making process, and that's what we find is the most effective way to build in consistency. Yes, of course, with increased communications, Teams, Zoom, all those things, we can meet online, but there's nothing to replace that. Somebody listening to what's happening, to other people chatting, and those kind of decision making processes really have to be done when we're all together. We have, with regard to mentoring, we have a system within the advocate deputy team of buddies. So when a new advocate deputy comes in, wherever they've come from, and we call from the Faculty of Advocates, from Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal, for solicitors who've got rights of audience in the High Court, and from self-employed solicitor advocates. So we have a diverse base of lawyers that come into the advocate deputy team. They also bring a full range of experiences, because they might not necessarily be only experienced in criminal law. They might come from a commercial background, a tax background, housing, specialised in housing law. And again, because we have that diverse team, the fact that we're all together in one place and we can share that knowledge, again, that's a huge benefit. The buddy system means that when someone comes in, we usually come into the team for about 3 years, unless you're going to stay on to be in one of the promoted posts. And within that 3 years, you start off with sort of easier trials, and a more experienced advocate deputy will mentor you through that preparation stage and the actual running of the trial. As well as individual buddies, we're all split into groups. So that group, each individual group will have probably 2 seniors and maybe 3, 4, 5 advocate trial advocate deputies. And those groups serve as both professional sounding boards and a place that you go to ask questions, and also social as well. So because we are split up and we're all moving about the country, we're trying to make sure that everyone is supported in that way.
Thanks very, very much. And Anne, in terms of looking at, we have a lot of women in forensic science and getting them up into those more senior roles. I think we're doing reasonably well in kind of team leader roles, but how do we go higher than that? Again, in Scotland, we have our first female forensic science director in the history of the provision of forensic science in this country, and that's only a very relatively recent appointment. I don't know if you want to say anything about your experience of how you said that things were changing in those boardrooms in Australia and in New Zealand, from that, and trying to get, or is it just something that is happening organically?
Yeah, I think it's potentially something that's happening organically, because there were some very, I guess, determined and smart women who happened to be in the field and came along. But something had to change. One of the things that really I'm passionate about is I've done a couple of courses when I was a manager before I became assistant director. And it was around empowering women to become, the next level senior, however far you wanted to go. And so it was teaching women to play on the playing field. I was an advocate for, we need to change the playing field. Not necessarily, let's bring in all these white males that were sitting at the top, let's face it, they were, and do a reverse mentoring scheme. If I've got to do an empowerment, don't get me wrong, I learned some useful tips in there, but at the same time, if I could have brought, say for example, my boss, who I'm not saying particularly wasn't for equality, but some of the people that I saw that came as the mentors or the sponsors of the women that were there, they were all male, every single one of them, and some of them weren't looking at even considering, well, why do I need to change the playing field? That person over there needs to learn how to play on this playing field. And I think that's an area that if we're going to make true ground and actually play on an even playing field, so I think that's an area we need to start looking at. So that women who are equally as good, or if not better, can, anybody, really doesn't just have to be women, anybody can actually get viewed as being a potential candidate for being in any of those roles. And that's the way that I go about it, is actually have a look at some of that reverse mentoring type program.
Do you know of other areas or fields where that sort of reverse mentoring is happening? And I'm wondering around things like entrepreneurship or technology or something like that. I'm not sure, that's why I'm asking the question.
I know I did come across it, and they were doing it in the government of South Australia, and for some reason they decided that they weren't going to run the program anymore, which I don't know why they pulled it for about 3-4 years before I was there. And I was talking to the woman who actually delivered those courses, and what she found the changes were in the people, or the attitudes of the people across that had been on those courses, the sponsors and the mentors that had come along. And she said it was quite phenomenal, some of that changing. And yes, okay, the government was a very big department, but if you ran it every year and got a few people and started changing the way, culture's not going to change overnight, but if you start on it and keep chipping away at it, it will certainly go there. And I think, she said she did start to see it across some of the areas of government.
Can I ask you to explain what you mean by reverse mentoring?
Yeah, so if my sponsor, say my sponsor was white male, would come along and say, yep, you need to go on this course, you're a female, we're going to teach you how to play on the playing field of the next level up. And a lot of that was around body language of males versus females, and how you should sit in a meeting with males so that they're not doing male posturing and making you feel small, how you can counteract that. And for me, the reverse mentoring is having that particular male in the room thinking about the same things. Like, gosh, if I sit like this, how is this perceived? And is it appropriate in a room without whether females and or males or whoever it may be? So them understanding what biases are coming into that playing field that they've brought into that.
I mean, that's really interesting, and it's critically important. I mean, you see it in almost every walk of life. Thinking of some of the meetings I had in my own organisation, where you're seeing the female people within that room adapting what they do in order to fit in, as it were. Whereas sometimes our male colleagues are simply oblivious to the fact that their behaviour hasn't changed, or their body language hasn't changed. So it's really interesting. It's very, very challenging, I think, area for development, but very important. We're coming to the time where it's really time for yourselves to start to think about some questions you might have. But some people provided questions beforehand, so I'm just going to have a look at some of those. Shanili, there was one particular question that came in for you, which was around your role in the School of Medicine, both as particularly around the medical education side, and asking, I think, also about your role as lead for the BME Staff Network. How do you foster inclusion and diversity, both, I think, within the way in which the students interact perhaps with each other, but also the way in which students and staff interact with each other.
So, first of all, I don't work alone. It's always in a team, so I'm speaking on behalf of the activities that we do with our teams. So we're based in Niamh, the medical school is outside, and something that perhaps folks in the main university don't understand is that because medical school, the nature of the course, it's quite regulated by GMC, which is the General Medical Council, as well as the BMA, which is the British Medical Association, and they have some very strict guidelines and policies around EDI, towards diversity and inclusion. So we do follow the DoD policies, but we are also governed by them. So I chair the Race Working Group and also responsible for the BMA network. And in that space, each of these diversity and inclusion. And we would say that diversity-wise, we're not doing bad. Our student cohort is very diverse. There's pressure on the university to employ diverse employees, so the staff body is also fairly diverse. Culture is one thing that hasn't kept pace as much. And that's worsening these because we're kind of admitting students but not really including them, so the respect for inclusion is not, and that can be pushing up. That's worrying. So a lot of the focus is around inclusion and we do a lot of work with students. Student voice is taken into account in almost every interaction. A lot of student reference groups are there for different networks. So we've got not just the DAE network, we've also got the LGBTQ+ network, we've got the disability network, and we try to work together. And that's because we work in silos, we kind of dividing our efforts. Like a number of goals are common. So we do try to work together to advance and complement each other. And a lot of student-staff partnerships there. So whether it's research programs, projects, ED interventions.
Thank you very much. Ashley, one for you, on slightly different, but bring in something that's a little similar. So we're at this, I would say, unprecedented part in history where we've got yourself as the Principal Crown Counsel, the Lord Advocate, and the Solicitor General, with all these women in these powerful roles. What difference will it make, or will it make a difference in terms of what can it change, particularly around things relating to equality, diversity, inclusion, both in the offices that you lead, but also, I mean, I'm very taken by Shirley's comment about bringing the students into the conversations. Is there something, and it may or may not be possible or the right thing to do, about bringing the sort of victim side of conversations into the way in which the Crown Office works?
There is, of course, a difference between the Crown Office and the team that I lead, because obviously the team I lead are independent Crown Counsel, and we're all deputies of the Lord Advocate. Within Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, there are all different levels of mentoring with regard to the different groups, and they have yearly awards and had a look at the website. So they have mentors who are out in the local offices championing and bringing to the fore the different diverse groups. So that is something that's happening at the COP offence level. With regard to the Lord Advocate being in a position, being a female, the Solicitor General, they bring personal qualities that might be tied to the gender, but they also have a very focused view of how they want the prosecution service to develop. And that, I think, being led by the Lord Advocate, is very focused on vulnerable groups, on witnesses, making sure that everyone involved in the criminal justice process is included and thought about, and that is particularly focused with regard to vulnerable witnesses. And that's something I know that's very strongly felt by the woman. I'm not sure if that's because she's a woman or that's because she is who she is.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to the floor. We've got about 5 minutes left. If anybody's got a question that they would like to ask, now is your time to put your hand up and shout it out. I'll go take one back first and then yourself.
Well, there's something that's being discussed regularly in this conversation from what I've gathered so far is that everything is based on sex. And you'll all be aware of the current conversations in politics, medicine, about the denial of biological sex. And you're talking about vulnerable witnesses there. And I was wanting to ask why the judiciary generally is compelling witnesses to lie about the sex of perpetrators, basically with the transgender issue, that men are being reported as females if they do crimes, and witnesses and everyone involved in the trial has to refer to the person who's done the crime as incorrect sex. And that also ties in with medicine, about denial of the actual biological sex of individuals and how that impacts healthcare and outcomes generally. So I was just wondering if you could potentially discuss how we're meant to navigate discussing sex and its impact on women in various industries, but then also in industry, as victims, in healthcare, in medicine, and as students. But then you're not actually allowed to properly discuss it, because if the person you're talking to has a protected characteristic, you're not actually allowed to engage with them as how you actually perceive them on a factual basis. It's quite a lot of topics at one go, but it does have a joint theme.
Just a few topics packed into that. I'm not entirely sure we're going to have a huge amount of time. We're going to go a couple of minutes left, but I don't know if anybody wants to have a go, and it might be something that you could put afterwards, if that's okay. If we want to take that question or defer it to after.
I can maybe answer a little bit of that. Being trauma informed is something that we are all trying to learn about, and to make sure that we are trauma informed when we deal with anyone in the judicial system. So if we're talking about accused persons or witnesses, we try to make sure that we are trauma informed. We also try to make sure that we have as much knowledge as possible. For particular, if we're talking about an advocate deputy who is conducting a trial with a transgender accused, then we want to make sure that that advocate deputy is properly informed. He knows how to refer to the accused person in court. He knows how, in the same way, if we have a witness who's transgender, we want to make sure that the advocate deputy has met the witness in advance and discussed all the particular issues that might come up when that witness is in court. So, although we might not get it right all the time, we do try.
And I would reiterate the same point with respect to medicine as well. I think we're all learning. This whole discourse about gender fluidity is new for a lot of people and a lot of specialities, and there are new guidelines coming up, and everybody's getting educated on this. And there will be mistakes. There will be, but I guess some of them will have to be excused because they are unintentional.
Okay, this is second question here.
You've all talked about how being passionate about what you're doing has been important as your career has progressed. As you've moved into more leadership roles, has anything surprised you or perhaps maybe frustrated with you as your own passion for set aside for passions towards your leading? Does that make sense?
It does. Anne, do you want to have a go?
I don't know that it surprised me, but I certainly had to let go of a lot. because I was used to being the expert and the leader of the science in that particular space. Then all of a sudden I found myself responsible with pathologists and DNA people underneath me, and I don't know what that is. So I had to change my mindset and trust them. You know, you had to give these people trust that they knew what they were doing. Yes, you can still guide them, but it's a very different role, and you have to think differently in that role. The challenge for me was one, letting go. It wasn't so much trusting the people, it was trying to understand enough of those new technical areas that I knew if they were talking sense to me or not. I think at that level I met a few interesting characters in the police force, shall we say, one in particular, and just navigating my way through that was interesting. In fact, it was in that position that I probably came across more, I guess, bias for being a woman, but minor, but calling it out every single time was something that was there. I walked into a meeting at the fire service, and the fire service officer who was in charge of that had chaired the meeting beforehand that I'd been sitting in. I walked into the meeting with two police officers, both male in uniform, chatting to them, went to sit down, and he looked at me and he said, "Oh no, your meeting's next door." So I turned round thinking the two police officers would follow me, thinking it was a bit odd because I knew everybody else in this room, but and then realised that they'd sat down. So I turned around to go back into the meeting, and he said, no, the Women's Committee on something is next door. This is the CBRN State Committee. And I just looked at him and said, well, I'll be in the right place, and sat down. And he realised what he'd done, was mortified, and did come apologise. But I spoke to him about it afterwards, because, you know, don't make those assumptions about, you know, women coming into meetings and stuff. So that, for me, I think was my hardest thing. It was the people I was having to call out and hold to account were higher up the chain than the ones who had been beforehand. Don't know whether that answered your question or not, but those were, I think, the biggest challenges that I had.
Improve the question a bit.
Oh, thank you. You're very kind.
Do you, either of yourselves actually see anyone to answer that one?
Yeah, I mean, invariably, it's as you move up positions, you're having to manage people, and there are things that you're more passionate about. Like I love my research, I love writing and publishing, and there isn't enough hours in the day because, you know, all these management, operational side of things just takes up so much time. Yeah, it's not much of a surprise, but
Ashley, a last word.
I'm the same, it's a completely different job for me, so I'm a little bit jealous when not necessarily when I see advocate deputies going out to start on a 6 or 7 or 8 week trial, or being in the thick of it at the weekend when they're trying to marshal the witnesses for the next week. But when they're getting to the end stage and they've gone through a trial and they've got the right result, and whether that be guilty or not guilty, sometimes the not guilty is the right result, and you get that buzz, and I look and I sometimes think of that and think, quite like to be doing that now. But other times, but it is a completely different job. And again, I like to go back into the appeal court, but in the appeal court you have to be completely focused on your argument for the next day or the day after or the day after. And you can't then be dealing with the deputy who's not well, there's a trial going down, and you've got to find another deputy to take over that halfway through the trial. You can't do that if you're focused on your appeal court sufficiency. So you just can't do it.
Thank you very much. We've reached the end of our hour. That flew by. Thank you again to our panellists, if you would give them a thanks in the usual way. And for your attendance, thank you for coming out this evening, for joining us this evening. This was hosted by the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science at the University of Dundee. I think you've been given feedback forms, so please, Heather is waving happily at me at the back. Please fill out the feedback forms if you wouldn't mind. Your feedback matters, it helps us shape the events that we put on and deliver. Thank you very much again, and safe home.